Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Developer Zone webinar. So every um, Thursday at 8 a.m. London time, we like to do a webinar for our ZP Developer Zone members. I'm sort of looking slightly to the, let's say, left because I've got a couple of monitors here. I'm just making sure everything's working okay. But anyway, welcome to the ZP Developer Zone. So every week at 8 a.m. London time, we like to do this kind of webinar for our ZP Developer Zone members. And I'll sort of jump straight into it. Now, I realize that recently we've had a bit of a time zone change in the UK, and that has caused some of our regulars to kind of be slightly missing the webinars because not all time zones have changed around the UK. I'm sorry, around the world. But the ZP Developer Zone is intended for our essentially for developers and academics who are interested in developing biosensors. And we have our sort of ZP Academy, which has free courses on it for people who are interested in learning about biosensors and electrochemical techniques. We have these webinars, and I think we've kind of consistently held this webinar now for over a year. We're probably at the 18-month mark. We have collaborations, so we are definitely, for example, recently we collaborated on some webinars and with some of our members and Shiraz University and IIT Bombay. So we do have a lot of collaborations. We offer jobs through the Developer Zone, and then we have the Developer Zone website itself. And I realize I might have to link to that. And our intention soon is to have workshops as well. So welcome to the ZP Developer Zone webinar. As I say, this goes out 8 a.m. Every Thursday London time. And I realize that the background to me today is a little bit different because we're actually at a conference and exhibition. And it's a conference and exhibition about, it's about farming and innovation, but we're here to talk about electrochemical measurements of nitrate in soil. So today, we often use the webinar format to actually talk about the questions that come in through the ZP Developer Zone forum. This week we didn't have any questions. Last week we actually had a lot of questions, but this week we didn't have any questions. So I've noticed it's been a long time coming. I first came across MIPS, or molecular imprinted polymers. It was definitely now 20 years ago. But it's one of these subjects, I think, with new science and new technology, you'd actually find that the adoption can take something like 20 years. So MIPS has been around probably even longer than that. By the time I was first aware of it, MIPS was probably already a science and a technology. But I first became aware of it, as I say, more like 20 years ago. But today I'm going to do a little chat about MIPS, and these are molecular imprinted polymers. Just to give you a context, MIPS can be used in the separation sciences, but I'm really interested in using them in the sort of analytical and detection science. It's not necessarily overt in my slides, but I'm really sort of interested in creating MIPS, molecular imprinted polymers, really on electrodes, and use them as a sort of sensing technique. So you will hear some kind of key words today. One of them is going to be electro polymerization, which is really the taking of a monomer, and you can polymerize monomers on electrodes if you use techniques like cyclovoltammetry. So we're going to talk about electro polymerization, template. So when we refer to template is often the target molecule. What is it that you're trying to detect? So, for example, if you're trying to detect androstenone, then the template would be androstenone. So this is the kind of molecule that you're actually interested in detecting. Then we have the wash step itself. What did I say? The wash step itself. So you can electropolymerize. If you do it in the presence of the template, then you will actually end up sort of embedding or partially embedding the template in the polymer. And then if you wash the polymer out, then you're left with the imprint of, sorry, if you wash the template out, then you're left with the imprint of the target. So The idea in molecular imprinted polymers, at least when you're using it for detection, is if you want to form your sensor, you will start with an electrode, you'll electro polymerize on it. In the presence of a template, the polymer will form around that template. And then when you wash that template around, you're left with an imprint of the template in the polymer. And that's essentially giving you the sort of specificity that you're looking for from the sensor. And then that's referred to as molecular imprinted polymers. I will go over this several times during the webinar today. If this is all, a little new, then we do have a couple of free courses at the ZP Academy, Introduction to Biosensors and Electrochemical Techniques for Biosensor Developers. So let's first of all just start off sort of fairly simple with electropolymerization. So the idea is you will take a electrode, I'm using one of the value gold electrodes here, and you will add a solution of monomer. These are single molecules that, if you use a technique like cyclovoltammetry, then these monomers will polymerize on your electrode. And in some ways, the more you cycle, then the more polymer you will deposit upon the electrode. So this is really an introduction to molecular imprinted polymers. And the first concept we're introducing here is really the concept of the concept of electropolymerization. So electrochemistry is very powerful because it's both a technique that can be used for synthesis and analysis. So what I'm describing here is the synthesis or fabrication of a polymer upon an electrode where the monomer is polymerized because of the techniques such as cyclovoltammetry. As I say, if you want to kind of have a deeper look into that, then I would take a look at those courses later on. So this is a sort of description of electropolymerization. Now, if we do the same process, we take one of our gold value electrodes, and we again deposit the monomer on top in a solution. But now we introduce the template. So I just earlier on said something like androstenone. There are other pesticides, herbicides. There are all sorts of things that people like to try and detect using molecular imprinted polymers. But I've introduced the template. And now when we polymerize, the idea is that the template is, let's say, encapsulated within the polymer. So the crucial step now is to then wash it, and we have to extract that template, and we're essentially left with a pore or hole or an imprint that is, in this case, let's say, the shape of the original target. I think it's a really quite simple in concept idea. If you're trying to build an equivalent sensor using antibodies or RNA capture probes, these can be actually quite tricky techniques. But the nice thing about molecular imprinted polymers is it's actually quite simple to make them. It's hard to make them good, and it's hard to make them really specific, but they are fairly easy to form. You can sort of do an experiment like this once you're set up in a couple of minutes. So in this example now, it's almost like the simplest molecular imprinted polymer. We just have a monomer in the presence of a template. We do cyclovoltammetry. We essentially encapsulate the template. And then when we wash it away, we're left with a pore or an imprint that later on then, when you retest this surface with your targets, you will have a surface that's specific to that target. So I'm now going to talk about the idea of actually, again, doing electropolymerization, but actually where you have a mixture of monomers. You might have some sort of monomers without any functional groups on them, and then you might add in a certain ratio of monomer with a functional group on it. Now, if I do this electropolymerization in the absence of the template, we're really just going to start with a surface that is functionalized, but doesn't necessarily have any kind of imprint of a particular target. I just want to say hi to FTAB, who's just come online. So morning, FTAB. I think the time zone's been catching people out, FTAB. So what I've described here then is the electropolymerization of monomers, where a certain ratio of the monomer is actually functional. And I would like to describe this as, let's say, it's got a lock moiety on it. I'll contrast that later on with like a key, but it's some sort of, I could call it a OH group, an alcohol group, but we've electropolymerized it. Now that's quite an interesting surface in some ways, because it is in some ways it's a functionalized surface. It's not just the polymer on there, but it actually has functional groups. But because we didn't do it in the presence of a template, you could just say that that's an electropolymerized polymer surface. So let's just contrast it now with the idea that we take the gold electrode, we add a solution of, again, monomers, but in there we have some functional monomers. We're going to electropolymerize it, but we'll do it in the presence now of a template molecule, which has functional groups that like to bond or with the functional group on the monomer. So a classic with that would be like a hydrogen bond. You might have an OH group and an OH group. But now we have the idea that the template is going to become encapsulated or embedded within the electropolymerized polymer. But it's not just sort of the polymer is not just taking the shape of the template, but it also has functional groups that have a sort of a specific interaction with it. And I think that really then helps with the specificity. So when I think about drug molecules, they often have a lot of functional groups on them. So I can see that a molecular imprinted polymer really works best with, let's say, targets that have more functional groups. And then, so when you wash it away, then you're left with a molecular imprint, but you've also got sort of specific functional groups in that pore. Now that is starting to look more like a catalytic site in an enzyme. It has a certain shape and also has functional groups in it. So I can see the sort of strength of the idea that you have shape and functionality, and I can see how that can then help you with specificity. Now, to contrast with that, you could also take monomers which had in this idea, a key functionality. So it was opposite to earlier on. You could do cyclovoltammetry and you can have a functional. This is almost like the opposite of what we were showing earlier on, where we now have a functional electropolymerized surface. We have some functional groups on it, but this is the kind of, I'm calling it the key moiety. Earlier I called it the lock moiety. But now this is not a MIP because we didn't do it in the presence of a template. So let's contrast that now and do it. Take one of our gold value electrodes, take the electrode, add the solution, and we add a ratio of, let's say, neutral monomers and a functionalized monomer. And now we get a sort of specific binding to our template, because our template has on it these lock moieties, which lock with our key moiety here. We do cyclovoltammetry, and we essentially start polymerizing around the template. And we create a pore, and we create a pore now, again, with functional groups. And if we wash that away, we're in a similar situation to the one I just showed, where we actually have really a pore which has the right shape and it has functional groups sticking into it, and that really helps them with the specificity. So yeah, molecular imprinted polymers look really, they're simple enough to form in the first instance. Optimization is a different matter, but they are simple enough to form. So people are very interested in these materials as alternatives to sort of more traditional binding type assays, which would use, for example, antibodies. Now, I want to sort of contrast this now with a final sort of, let's say, statement around or ideas around this, that you now take a mixture of monomers. Here we've got a neutral monomer, a monomer with a key moiety in it, a monomer with a lock moiety on it. You can do cyclovoltammetry, which will start the polymerization process. And now if you do that in the presence of the template molecule, now this template molecule is more interesting, and this is typically like a drug molecule, that you might have an NH2 group, an amine group, and you might have an alcohol group. So you've got different functional groups. And then because you have a mixture of monomers going in here, you can end up arranging the monomers due to the functional groups on the template. So now you have a, I would say this site is more specific because this molecule can only go into this pore when it's binding here and it's binding here, and that really helps with the sort of specificity of it. So if you wash it away, then you're left with really something that's, again, more like an enzyme catalytic site, where you have the right shape. The molecule can only go in essentially at the right orientation, that it has to bind here and it has to bind here. So that's quite a, it's starting to look like quite a specific pore. So I didn't have a summary slide, but I should have had a summary slide. But if I was to summarize this, then molecular imprinted polymers have been around for at least 20 years. One application of molecular imprinted polymers is in sensing. Now, when you use them in sensing and you want to use a molecular imprinted polymer, electro polymerization is a good technique, because you can start off with a monomer, you can do a technique like cyclovoltammetry, and the monomer will become a polymer. Now, if you do that in the presence of the template, then the monomer will form around the template, and you'll start getting an imprint of the template into the polymer. And then if your template has functional groups on it, like amine groups, carboxylic acid groups, alcohol groups, you can then start to use a mixture of monomers, which will you can then use a mixture of monomers which will bind to that template and those functional groups. And then when you polymerize it, you should be able to create, you hope to be able to create a imprint, which is the right size of the template, and it has specific group interactions. And then you have to wash it away, and then you're left with essentially I'm calling it a catalytic site. It's like an enzyme's catalytic site, but rather than being catalytic, it's just a binding site. So maybe the better analogy is actually almost with an antibody. So I just want to answer a question that came through: is how do we control the uniformity of polymerization on SPEs? Yeah, it's a good question, because I think on screen printed electrodes, for me, because the screen printed electrode is quite small, we do get good uniformity when we're doing electropolymerization. And I might just try and illustrate that really quickly. And I'm sorry that I'm sort of suddenly, a good question's come through during let's say, the webinar. So I'm just going to drag in and try and essentially answer that question in real time. So we had a question that came through from Aftab.
Okay,
and
so what the hell is error?
Just bring up a quick video and try and answer that question. So I got a feeling this is a video that is on the ZP YouTube site. So this is us doing. It's not a MIP, but it is a electropolymerization. I know this is not what the video is intended for. But what we've done is we've done an electropolymerization on this screen printed electrode. And the reason it's changing color is because we're doing cyclovoltammetry at the same time. So we're effectively changing the oxidation state of the electrode deposited material. And the reason I bring that up is, I can maybe see some heterogeneity in there, but it's not terrible. And the reason I say this is, I think when you do electrodeposition on small electrodes, I think it really helps with the homogeneity of the deposition. So I'm not going to say it's perfect, but I actually think that screen printed electrodes, their small size and the compactness of all the electrodes next to each other actually helps with the homogeneity. So I was kind of a bit thrown by the question because it's not something that we particularly suffer from. But I'm wondering if it's because we are using screen printed electrodes a lot. And so if you did it on a larger electrode, I can actually imagine that the heterogeneity was actually more of, let's say, more of an issue. But I must admit, it's not something that we really particularly suffer from. So I'm just going to sort of finish off here now and say that thank you for the questions this week. As I say, this was a slightly different webinar this week because we didn't have a lot of questions through the ZP Developer Zone. But I just wanted to say thank you for AFTAB for asking an interesting question. So if I was to summarize it, we have noticed an upturn in molecular imprinted polymers. People are very interested in them. Using molecular imprinted polymers for sensing is a fairly easy technique to use. I can definitely see the advantages over traditional like antibodies and enzymes and things like that. I think the only concern is sometimes with specificity. Probably the more functional groups on your template, I think that would actually make the technique more powerful because you've got a lot more locks and keys to kind of hook onto. All right, so I will say thank you for attending the webinar this week.